So hey folks, Jeff Salzman here, and welcome to the Daily Evolver. Tonight, I am welcoming on the show a man that I have wanted to interview for a long time. It's Frederic Laloux, who is the author of the best-selling book, Reinventing Organizations. And it's a book that has spurred, a significant movement in the business world. And what I love about it especially is that it explicitly uses an integral developmental evolutionary model to, make its points, and makes the thesis being that there's a next stage organization that is emerging. So how'd I do, Fred?
That was pretty awesome.
So that's a basic thing. So you let me just give a little bit more about who you are and where you're coming from here. You were a McKinsey consultant, and that's of course the high level gold standard of consultant and global management, and left to become a fancy pants kind of consultant yourself. And then left that, and this was in Europe, came to the States, and now wrote the book, Reinventing Organizations, and got it forward from Ken Wilber, and I think you're up to 400,000 copies now.
Yeah.
And that's astonishing. So hallelujah and thank you.
Yeah, I'm still pinching myself. I self-published this book, and I remember everybody telling me at the time that that was, the stupidest idea ever, because I'm not a marketer, I'm not a self-promoter, I, wasn't on Twitter, I, barely had a handful of Facebook friends, but I just sensed that, I just needed to focus on the book and not on trying to get a publisher and thinking about, that in some ways that would take care of itself. And I hear that in the world of publishing, this, is a unicorn, like, a self-publishing book that ends up selling 400,000 copies. And it's a pretty thick, dense 400-page book. I mean, I think it's quite readable, but it's still, pretty dense.
Yeah.
Management.
There it is. And it has, all these words and sentences and paragraphs and pages. But, if that seems a little daunting, there's also this version, which is Reinventing Organizations Light, and it's got pictures.
Yeah, so that,
and this is
I wrote that.
Yeah, this is my version right here.
Yeah, I wrote that 2 years later because I heard from so many people who said, like, I read your book, I loved it, it touched me deeply, and I want to talk with everyone around me, about this book. But so many people, are just not the type that take in information, through a thick 400-page book.
Yeah, yeah.
And so then
I'm not anymore. I feel like I used to be, but I'm not sure I am anymore. Anyway, I like the light version. And, again, so what I wanted to really look at with you is, the thing that's most interesting to me, and I think to our listeners, is, you're mapping out this next stage organization. And it's not just theoretical. You're finding organizations that are actually living up to the principles that you're talking about. And to an evolutionary, that's just like, you got me at, the next stage kind of thing. Because we know that throughout history, the history of humanity, humans have organized themselves in a series of organizational structures that were unimaginable from the previous one. Yeah. If you think from going from indigenous bands to tribes to then, empires and then modernity, and then post-modernity, we all get really nice and sensitive. It's really an amazing thing. And each of those stages has its own structures. And I think the best way to sort of download what you have to the listeners is to just, why don't we walk up through those first 4 or 5? And then we'll move into the next stage, which is the emergent, and I love that you call it teal organization, which is using Ken Wilber's Aqua Maps. Yeah. So you want to start there?
Yeah, we can do sort of a very quick tour of 10,000 years of human history when it comes to organizations. From what we seem to know, from what historians and anthropologists tell us, we used to live for the longest time of humanity in pretty egalitarian bands. And at some point, we switched to an age of larger tribes, where we had suddenly hierarchy emerging in the form of a big man, a chief. In integral language, we would call that a red stage, the warrior stage. And we needed a chief to keep everyone else safe. And that, it seems to be the first moment where we had organizations, some sort of division of labor. And at the time it was one tribe invading a next tribe and making slaves. But that sort of perspective on how we should organize ourselves is still around today when you look at mafias and street gangs, right? It's very loosely organized. It's generally a man who is at the very top, and he has to show no sign of weakness and has every once in a while to show real signs of violence to keep everyone in control, because if he shows a sign of weakness, a younger fellow will come up and put a knife in his back and claim his spot.
Sometimes
right?
It does, yeah.
Yeah, so that's how street gangs and mafias are organized, and it sends us back all the way to sort of the tribal age. And then from what we know, humanity made this huge leap with the agrarian revolution to the age of empires and institutions and organized religions. And when we look back, that's also when we made a real leap in terms of how people got organized. And so rather than being these sort of wolf packs with an alpha wolf, as we had in the red stage, in this amber stage, if we use Ken Wilber's colors, in the agrarian stage, the metaphor of good organizations is that a good organization is like a good army, right? And that's when we invent strict hierarchies, the pyramid and fixed reporting lines, and I'm your boss, you're my subordinate, right? And the most emblematic of these organizations might be the Catholic Church, right? Because we all know it. It was started then, it's been around for 2,000 years, extraordinarily stable, and where people start to identify with their box in the org chart, right? And the levels of violence go down quite dramatically. The
complexity just, explodes.
Explodes, right? You can suddenly send in, missionaries to the other part of the world as part of your organization, and it's incredibly stable, and it lasts for 2,000 years, and it invents replicable processes, right? You don't reinvent the wheel every time like mafias and street gangs do. You actually have very replicable processes. And the priests no longer all scheme to backstab the bishop. There is something where we are now bound by rules and by processes, and we accept our place in the hierarchy. It's a whole different type of organization.
Yeah.
That is able to do things that previous organizations weren't able to do. And then we have to wait, another number of centuries for another big leap, which we know was the scientific industrial revolution, right? The leap to modernity. And again, we pretty much reinvent organizations from the ground up, right? And the metaphor changes again. So a good organization is no longer a good army, because that's way too slow. That's way too static. A good organization is a well-oiled machine, right? Because the worldview changes. The worldview is no longer static like in agrarian societies with absolute laws passed down from the gods, absolute right and wrongs. Suddenly the worldview is that the world is this intricate mechanic, right? And the better I understand the mechanic, the more I investigate it with scientific methods, the faster I am, the more I can outcompete other people, the more glory and riches come to me. And so that's when organization make a number of amazing breakthroughs where they invent stuff like innovation. We don't need to do the same thing next year as we did this year. Actually, we want to do something different because we want to outcompete everybody else. And so we invent R&D and marketing and product development.
The sense of progress. And,
real sense of progress.
The movement of history in a way starts to set in because we can actually see history.
Exactly.
And so, being creative, creating something new becomes the sort of watchword, what you're looking for.
Yeah. And then there's other amazing breakthroughs that come with that, like the notion of meritocracy, right? If you look at the previous stage, you had caste systems, and, Pope would always come from a noble family. It would never be a peasant that rises through the ranks, right? That was just unthinkable. Simple priests were peasants, but not popes. But suddenly this new worldview, the smartest person should go to the top. And, just this immense liberation that comes with this notion of meritocracy. And that brings this whole arsenal of HR practices, because we suddenly invent, something that in management terms is sometimes called management by objectives. So it's no longer command and control. I no longer tell you exactly what to do and how to do it. I just give you targets, and then you can run. And as long as you more or less make your numbers, I don't want to know how you do it. And so there's a degree of freedom that comes with that didn't exist in previous stages. And with that, we invent this whole HR arsenal of budgets and objectives and targets and KPIs and stock options and, bonus schemes and, yearly performance evaluation. I mean, all of that is the invention of modernity.
Yeah, the modern world. And so let's pause for a minute. That's, the skyscrapers, the cars, the endless supply of safe food, all of the stuff that
hospitals,
we have in our life.
Healthcare, and public education. And
doubled lifespans, education. I mean, what Daniel Dennett said, a spectacularly tangible result of modernity. Yeah,
exactly. And yet, this heart seems to have run its course.
Yeah.
Right?
The beat goes on.
The beat goes on. And it seems like that whole management edifice of modernity that I just evoked, that we teach in business schools, that all our expensive MBAs teach to millions of people around the world, seems to be at wit's end, seems no longer quite to know what to do, because the world is moving on, is becoming ever more complex, ever more uncertain, volatile, and because our longings and our hopes and our expectations are moving on.
Mm-hmm.
Right? There's all of these surveys that show that people are by and large disengaged from their work, right? And especially these larger organizations with their multiple levels of hierarchies and all of these processes that sound good on paper, but no longer work in practice, and disempower everyone in just this blob of bureaucracy and of meaninglessness, of trying to reach targets that no longer mean anything. And so there's a real disillusionment with something that used to be enormously liberating at some point.
No, it's that's part of how and why we move forward. Is the status quo starts feeling suffocating.
Exactly.
And we realize that we're a sort of a cog in a machine, and nobody wants that. So onward. Yeah,
but maybe this that I want to add is, because this is so much the background to at least the corporate world, that it is almost invisible, right? It's just the water that we swim in. And so many people are unhappy, either are burning out or feel underused, feel that their work is meaningless, that they have bullshit jobs. But they don't know often how to frame it. And that's why it was so important to me in the first part of the book to take this sort of this grand historic narrative, because so many people blame themselves and say, what's wrong with me? Why can't I find meaning in my work? Why can't I find work that I'm happy with?
Yeah, we're all told to pursue your passion.
Exactly, right? And find your purpose in life. And I think there is something very liberating when we realize, maybe there is nothing wrong with me. Maybe the system itself is failing us, is no longer working for us.
Yeah.
And I'm just sort of a collateral damage to this stage in evolution.
Yeah. So a new hunger, a new realization comes online, and how would you describe that?
So some people call it the postmodern stage, right? Or the green stage. And that stage really starts to question the premise of modernity and saying, hey, this single-minded pursuit of faster, cheaper, better, of
more,
constant optimization and innovation simply to gain market share and more profit. There's other important things in life. There's respect, and there's tolerance, and there is one another, and there is, it becomes a dissolution with hierarchy.
Yeah.
And people,
and also we realize the limits of growth in terms of the globe.
Exactly. And the planet and
resources and climate and
And, but often the stage doesn't, knows what it doesn't like, but I find it very hard to formulate something else. And so sort of the radical proposal that came already sort of at the end of the 19th century and early 20th century was sort of radical egalitarianism, or the idea of cooperatives where we would all be equal. But then we noticed that doesn't work. Running a large organization of 1,000 people by consensus, or 10,000 people with everybody being absolutely equal, that just doesn't work.
Right.
But still,
it's hard to run a group of 6 or 8 with that kind of an attitude, honestly.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so it took a while for some new breakthroughs to materialize, but they came. And that sort of the big contribution that next stage made, and you could call it the information age, if you don't like postmodernity, was the notion that next to all the hard side of business, that, all of the budgets and strategies and targets and all of that, there's this whole other side, the soft side of business, right? And that's when suddenly there was this explosion of all of these notions of servant leadership, and managers shouldn't be autocrats. They should really be coaches. And a famous sentence from Peter Drucker that that culture eats strategy for breakfast, right? Which we would basically say green eats orange for breakfast, right?
Yeah.
But basically what they mean is, if you have a wonderful culture, a culture where people listen to one another, are caring one another, where everybody's voice and intelligence counts and comes to the table, that beats the best strategy that you can imagine. And so that's when we started having all of these leadership development programs, right, and all of these culture transformation programs that we see in large organizations.
This was also concurrent with the influx of women into the workplace.
Yep.
If you think of this, particularly getting in the 70s and 80s, that was enormous.
Yeah. And then the explosion of nonprofits.
Yeah.
Right. The whole world of nonprofits and social entrepreneurs.
Right.
And yet, that's still not where the story ends, right?
Right. Yeah. Well, and the downsides of that are what? I mean, so we have a gig economy, we have a sense of insecurity. I mean, what would you say about it? There's a hollowed out middle.
Absolutely. And a lot of that is still sort of the aftermath of modernity.
Right.
But in these very culture-driven organizations, you start to face a dilemma. And that is that, you keep the fundamental architecture of the organization, you keep the pyramid intact, and you're trying to change it with a benign culture.
Mm-hmm.
So you keep having a hierarchy, you keep having somebody else having power over other people.
Yeah.
Right? Say, Jeff, you're a boss to 1,000 people. You have power over these people. It's undeniable.
Mm-hmm.
But then you're being sent to all of these leadership development programs, all these culture programs that tell you, but please, Jeff, be a benign leader. Be a servant leader. Actually, we gave you that power. Please don't use it. Right? I remember.
Well, actually, it's a legitimate. It kind of makes sense as the next stage. I mean, we still have to work with this amazing machine of modernity because it's given us the goodies.
Exactly.
But we want to bring in a more evolved interior, you might say.
Exactly.
Where we use the tools of it with more humanity and more benignly.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I remember I had this image that I put in a book, and it was the only sentence that my my editor was reading, for just proofreading for mistakes, said, you can't use this sentence in the United States. You have to change this. I'm coming from a European Belgian sensitivity, and I was just using this image. It's like, keeping the power structure intact, but then trying to have everybody be, a benign dictator, is kind of like giving all the children in kindergarten a gun and then teach them all the time not to use it. Right?
Yeah.
And sorry, just replace that with a stick. But that's basically what it is. You give people real power over other people, and then you have to constantly invest in training and culture programs to make sure that all that power is used benignly. And there's some wonderful examples. I mean, Southwest Airlines and Ben and Jerry's and Starbucks, and there's some organizations with just really amazing cultures out there that work on that model. So it's a model that can work, but is just requires this immense and constant investment.
Where would you put like a Google or even an Apple?
Well, really,
are they getting some new territory?
It's hard for me to judge because I haven't researched them, but just from an outside perspective, they still feel very, very modern in their outlook. I mean, they have ping pong tables and sushi bars.
Well, they may be what you're talking about with the green in a sense, because they do have modern structures, but they have really pretty intense cultures, right?
Yeah. But it's interesting. I think they still come from this extremely, especially Google, from this extremely engineering, data-driven mindset. There's this fascinating study that they did that cost them a huge amount of money, where they did extraordinarily large data-driven exercise to understand which teams are performing well and why. So looking at the best performing teams and crunching all the possible data on all possible criteria. So coming at it, from this very, scientific industrial perspective, and then finding a result that, of course, won't surprise you or me, but from a lot of people is this big aha, which is, it's basically the psychological safety within the team that matters. Can people, speak up? Can people make their voice heard? Does it feel like a safe place where we can, that was it. But it was interesting how they got to something which probably to you and me makes obvious sense, but they got right through, just crunching tons of data, because that's just how they tend to approach things.
Well, it makes sense now that you mention it. In a way, I'm not sure I would have thought of it on my own. But yeah, I mean, who isn't going to be accessing their highest and best when they feel like people care, they see me, I'm safe to be me. I could be Jeff.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
Absolutely.
And I can actually express Jeff, and I can have my life's purpose be enmeshed somehow in the purpose of this organization, so that I could go home at night and feel good about my day.
Exactly.
Who doesn't want that? And working with people who I see in the same way, I see them as clearly and, receive them as fully as they receive me. And yet it's a professional setting, and, so I get a little lost here. So Fred, so here we're moving now into the new world, right? This is the new integral teal organization. And how would you lay it out?
Well, let me first say this is, so I knew of this sort of arc of history and, this integral perspective. And so I was really curious, and I went out there researching, are there already organizations, that operate in part or maybe wholly on, from the next stage, because I just knew that, this dissatisfaction with the current models is pretty widespread, right? The number of executives that leave their job because at some point they say, you know what, I no longer want to do this. I no longer want to participate. The number of nurses and doctors who leave hospitals because they say, hospitals have just become these really inhospitable places, and the number of teachers who leave schools. I mean, and I just had this hunch that, at least some of them must have recreated an organization based on their perspective, on the way they see the world. There must be, at least, one school out there, and, some companies and for-profits. And so I started actively researching organizations that might operate differently. And what was striking in the research is that I started seeing a number of places. And in the end, I researched 12 organizations in pretty great depth who didn't know of one another. And yet often operated on pretty remarkably similar, not only principles, but sometimes even practices.
Interesting.
As if they were downloading sort of the same code at the same time, as if there was something that was ready, something in the air, just like several people, have discovered, differential calculus or something at the same time. It just seems, the time just seemed ready for a number of people to discover this code. And it's been quite fascinating at how happy they were to discover that they weren't the only ones, because they often thought they were the only fools who really dared to question the sort of the whole edifice of management that business schools tell us. Mm-hmm. And everybody was telling them they were crazy, but they just, were adamant that they just needed to do something different. And it was interesting to me that the reason they wanted to do something different is not because they wanted to get more profit or be more effective or more agile or more, there was something from within. There was just something that in them that said, you know what, the old way, I simply cannot do this. Like I simply cannot get myself to do it. I just need to do something else that, that is in line with how I see the world, with my integrity. Mm-hmm. And these are pretty remarkable organizations.
Yeah. Well, it seems again so obvious, but it really is radical to assume that I actually can make my life count. And I'm actually not willing to not make it count. I'm not willing to do this. And of all the nerve, human beings, after all of our history, get the nerve to just say, no, I can't do it this way anymore. And that's, of course, the evolutionary urge that moves us forward. And this is just the latest incarnation of that. But I always think that, some of the markers of the evolutionary urge is that you're just bored to tears with what's going on. Exactly. You just feel suffocated by it. I can't take it another minute. and then on with the show. Yeah. So then, how would you describe these organizations? I know you've done real research into them and have identified quite a number of them. What would you say is some of the common themes?
Yeah, so there are, I believe, 3 breakthroughs that come with that leap. One of them is this notion of self-management. So you start to see more and more organizations, and now they're popping up all over the world, like the movement is really accelerating, of organizations that no longer function with a pyramid, that really function with distributed authority.
They don't function with a what?
With a pyramid.
Oh, pyramid, yes.
A pyramid, with one person at the top and then a number of direct reports and then more direct reports. And so you have a number of really extraordinary organizations that have thousands of people where you don't have a single boss-subordinate relationship. You no longer have anybody holding power over anyone else. And that sounds absolutely crazy because we've just been so conditioned to think that, hey, the only way we can get things done, come on, let's be serious, is, somebody needs to call the shots, right? Yeah. You were just saying it like, we can't make consensus work with a group of more than 6 to 8 people. How could it ever work with 1,000 people?
Right.
And the problem with self-management is that as soon as you say that word, almost everyone gets a wrong impression. Almost everyone, for some reason, things, 1960s, 70s, hippy-dippy, consensus, let's all sit in a big room and talk as long as it takes. And, maybe in 2 weeks we'll make a decision. And and no structure, and and that's not the case at all. So you have manufacturing organizations that compete against cheap Chinese imports, and they work with extraordinarily thin margins, and they work with self-management. And all of the examples of self-managing organizations I've seen seem to outperform traditional organizations by leaps and bounds. Again, the interesting thing is that's not why people do it, but it's just a result. There's just something that is extraordinarily more productive when you distribute authority than when you centralize it.
So it's not like there's no rules, right?
Absolutely. Thank you for bringing that up. So there's just as much structure. There are just as many rules of the games. It's just a different rule of the game. So what's interesting is that
we're not, it's interesting even if we think about evolution. When people talk about the next stage, unless you're really ready for it, it sounds like a reversion to an earlier stage.
Exactly.
So what this sounds like to the common ear is a reversion to chaos.
Exactly.
And
it's the exact opposite. So what these organizations had to do, and I found it so fascinating to research, is they had to solve just a number of very practical questions. Okay, so we no longer want somebody having power over somebody else, but then who can make what decision? And if people disagree and there's conflict, who resolve that? It's if there's no longer a boss, to cut the knot. And who gets a pay raise at the end of the year? Right. And do we still have targets? And so, they had to.
And these are highly charged issues in first tier organizations.
Exactly. And what happens if somebody slacks off? And, how do we do performance evaluation if there's no boss around? So, and so the really exciting thing is that there's enough of these organizations out there for us to have the answers to these questions. We now know how to do this. Like, this is no longer a mystery. Like, there have been organizations like this that have been operating sort of in the shadows for 30, 40, 50 years. And we just know how to do this. Okay, so who can make what decision? Well, there's something called the advice process. There's something called, consent-based decision-making. We just, we know how this operates, and we know that this operates extraordinarily well, even at large scales. We know how to set salaries. We just know all these things.
All right, so let me stop you there. You mentioned two processes, one being the advice process, the other being the consent process.
Yeah.
Just give us the outlines.
Okay. So the advice process, it's not my name or concept. It's a person called Dennis Backey who created a 40,000 people firm that operated with the advice process.
Do we know the name of the firm?
It's called AES. And so they were founded from the beginning with these kind of concepts. Unfortunately, 20 years in, a new CEO was appointed, and it's a more traditional CEO, and now it's returned to become a more traditional organizations, but they've run for a long time with extraordinary success with the advice process. And the advice process, in essence, is very simple. It says that anybody in the organization can make any decision, provided that they seek advice from people with expertise, right? It would be stupid to make a decision, not ask people who know something about the question. And B, seek advice from people who will have to live with the consequences of that decision, who will be meaningfully impacted. And then that person seeks that advice, and enriched by that advice, at some point goes like, this is the best decision I can think of, and makes that decision. So there's sort of a mini process of collective intelligence that happens in the brains of that one person. Now notice, it's not consensus, right? Often it's impossible to reconcile all of the sometimes conflicting advice that people might give. But to the best of their knowledge, that person decides, this is the decision.
Right. And the bigger the decision, the more people they
obviously
have to get input from. Right.
Exactly.
And these rules are laid out.
These rules have laid out. Sometimes it's as simple as that. Others, have more details to it of, who do you need to ask for advice and how do you do it.
Okay. So that's the advice process. You get the advice, you make the decision.
But think about this, how radical this is, right? So if you have an organization of 10,000 people, it means that there's now 10,000 people who no longer need the approval of anybody. They no longer need to make a Word memo or PowerPoint deck to bring to the next level of management that brings it one more level up, then brings it one more level up to the executive committee, who has 10 minutes to look at it and then makes a decision without fully understanding all of the implications, right? It means 10,000 people are fully empowered. You notice something that could be better. You just go out there, get advice, and make it happen. So the number of decisions that get made, are suddenly multiplied by 100 or by 1,000. The organization is just, suddenly firing on 10,000 cylinders instead of firing on, the 10 cylinders of the executive committee.
Mm-hmm.
There's a
I'm having a hard time wrapping my head around it. I've maybe steeped in these earlier models.
Exactly. And that brings up, I imagine, with you and maybe people listening, all sorts of questions, because it just sounds almost too good to be true, right? There's this sort of, yes, but yes, come on, like you can't be serious, right? People can't just decide to spend money and all of these things. And what happens if people shoot from the hip and, they pretend to listen to advice, but, they already made up their minds. And what's extraordinary about the advice process is how robust it is, because we're constantly enmeshed in a network of advice processes, right? I come to ask you for advice, and you will give me that advice, right? And you expect me to really think it through and really take it into account. And maybe I will make a decision in a different direction, but only after I've really thought it through, right? You expect that from me.
Yes.
So when this afternoon I come to you, because you've asked me for advice, it's very difficult for you to simply discard my advice, because we're constantly on both sides of that thing. And, if in the end I make a decision and I come back to you and say, Jeff, I've listened to everybody and I've really thought this through, and this is a decision, I know you might not like it because, you had a different preference. You tend to have a huge amount of respect for me, because you know how hard it is, because you've been in the same situation. Mm-hmm. Of having to make a call where that some people might not be happy with it. Mm-hmm. But you just, took your chances and took your responsibility. So you know how hard that is. And so you respect the fact that I do the same thing.
No, I get that. And I get that, there is a bigger self that we can all inhabit, where we could trust each other to bring a wisdom to the situation. And it's amazing how much wisdom we have when there's room for it. I'm hung up maybe just a little bit on the technicalities, but could somebody in HR, for instance, go buy a new, Chevy for the, what parameters of decisions you can make are there, or are there any? Do we just trust this wisdom that miraculously comes online when we operate this way? And I think there is such a thing, but what do you think?
Well, the one part that we need to understand about these self-managing systems is that they're self-correcting. Just like systems in nature are constantly self-correcting. So an interesting feature of all of the self-managing organizations is, next to having a different decision-making process, they also all have a clear conflict resolution process. Because if you, Jeff, suddenly go out there and buy a Chevy, and that's just outrageous, there has to be a very clear mechanism for me to hold you to account, right?
Okay.
And so you won't do this a second time, and
right.
We'll learn from it, and then common sense kicks in, right?
Right.
If I'm in HR, I'm not going to buy a new production machine, like even if I have an idea, because I'm going to talk to the production guy, obviously, right. The production girl, right? I mean, we wouldn't make any sense to overstep that boundary. And then we have some rules of engagement. So we might no longer have a travel policy. You might be able to buy your own flight tickets, but then we might have just some guidelines. Hey, if we fly within the United States or within Europe, we fly economy. And if we fly transatlantic, we fly business. Or I'm just making this up. And so we have, we just develop.
All right, so these rules are, again, there's just kind of a new set of rules or a new way of relating to rules, but they're still rules.
And if you want to change your rules, anybody can, open up the rules and saying, hey, we just realized these rules no longer make sense. I want to amend them. I want to change them. Right? Because you feel a tension.
Well, this gets me maybe to this next piece, the consent piece. Yeah. And let's put that on the table, because I think it really, in a way, they work together.
Yeah, so this is, now you're really getting technical and nerdy, and I love this about, geeky around decision-making processes. But so the consent-based decision-making is what some organizations decide for really, really touchy, important subjects, where they say, hey, rather than just the advice process, we want some people to be able to make principled objections that pause the process and force us to integrate different perspectives. So it's not consensus. We don't want everybody to agree with it. Just if somebody has a principled objection, we can voice that and we can integrate it. So you come asking for advice, I give you advice, but say, hey, here, in your proposal, I have a principled objection. And you, at that moment, you can't move forward until you and I have really sat together and figured it out. And so this is much more time intensive, and so is generally reserved for just, a handful of important decisions, where we say, hey, here we don't want to take the risk of getting it wrong. We don't want, of just you, Jeff, integrating all of the advice and still possibly just, having a partial perspective. We really want to make sure that we integrate all of the perspectives. So it's a very integral sort of approach. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, I know that you are aware of and have respect for the management approach of holacracy. Mm-hmm. And I worked with Brian Robertson, who's sort of the evangelist for holacracy, back in the Integral Institute days when we were first starting out. Yeah. And there are about 40 people, and we did his interlocking system of circles. Yeah. And I don't remember how that worked necessarily, but here's what was magical and miraculous about it. We would have these consent meetings. We were going for consent instead of consensus. Yeah. And it would be like for instance, one thing we might be doing is creating a seminar. So we have all of the people from the people who are managing the trainers, the people who are in the finance, and the different characters in a room. And I'm forgetting the details, but what was essential about it is that somebody would make a proposal. The rest of the people, in a very organized way, again, very highly rule-based. It was fun in a way. Yeah. We go around, and all they were allowed to do would be ask clarifying questions, so that we made sure that we understood what this person's problem was and what they were going to do to solve it. So they were basically identifying a stressor in their job, in their system. And we would have a lot of these meetings, so they wouldn't have to fester, and but these meetings would be short and powerful. So then we'd ask the questions, and then unless there was an objection from somebody, that their decision would be implemented, knowing that 3 days later we can adjust it, whatever, if there's a new tension that arises, a new stress that arises. Yeah. So what was really, and I may have mangled it a little bit, but the key is that we were looking for stressors. We were alleviating these stressors, and we were the person who was involved with it would make the decision unless there was an objection, and we weren't asked to offer opinions or tell stories or think about what ifs or brainstorm or any of that kind of stuff. So these meetings became very focused, and the ball would move so fast and efficiently that, honest to God, Fred, there were a couple meetings where I felt like there was a liftoff of the we space. Yeah. That we were all operating from a higher space together. Yeah. And, evolution's funny. It was fragile. It ultimately didn't last. I don't know if we were, committed to it as we should be, but I do know that there was a liftoff of the we space that lets me see into what's next. And not just what's next in terms of how we organize ourselves in terms of, the productions of goods and services, but just the way we organize ourselves and the way we relate to each other in all kinds of ways.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah. And that's pretty exciting, because we really are imagining a new way of relating. Yeah. And in the second person, also in the third person in terms of creation, but also just.
Yeah, so there's something remarkable. I don't know if you put it in those terms, but that happens with some of these mechanisms that are just pretty ruthlessly efficient.
Yes.
Is that a lot of the ego stuff, gets drained out of the room.
Yes, that's exactly what happens.
And we know that we will be heard. We know that we can contribute. There's no fear. All of the fear when people hold power over you, or when you hold power over other people, is poison, because it brings so much of our egos and our shadows out into those meetings, and all of the politics and all of the games we play, and all of the fears of what if that person says this and I have to prepare this, and before the meeting let me talk to this person and then that person just in case that happens, and let me warn them about all of that.
All of that's off the table.
All of that's off the table because we trust that the mechanism is robust, and I can just show up, not be particularly prepared, and in the meeting
yes, it needs to. And in real time, we're looking at a real stress that's happening in the system, and we're alleviating it. And then we're moving on, baby, because tomorrow's a new day. And there's something about that. And in dropping, and I love what you said about dropping the ego. It's not about looking good. And that's not to say that, of course, outside of these consent meetings, you could do all the stuff that human beings do. And how great is that? But in these consent meetings, there's a new thing that emerges.
And what's fascinating to me, and Brian Robertson often says that, is you get to this state where we have much less of the ego and the politics and all of that show up actually through better structures.
Yes.
Not through people doing leadership development and working hard on, right? But then the systems actually invite us to do all of that inner work.
Yeah. Yeah, and I love how Ken wrote about it in your foreword to your book, about it's not like the pyramid goes away in a way. There's still power that's organized, but people can move through the pyramid and be where they could be 100% powerful.
Exactly.
And be wherever they need to be in that pyramid.
So that's exactly it. So what is striking about these self-managing system where authority is distributed is that everybody is fully powerful by design. And what happens then is you no longer have these power hierarchies, these dominator hierarchies. They disappear. But a frequent misunderstanding is that then people believe that everybody's the same. People talk about flat organizations, and I don't like that term at all. What happens then is that you have natural hierarchies that emerge, right? On any one question, some people will be more knowledgeable, will know more, will have more interest, will have more excitement, will have more background and skills. So on that question, they're taller than everyone else. And hooray, that's great. Let them take the lead, let them run with it.
Right.
And another question, somebody else is taller, right? And so these organizations aren't flat or equal. What you want is everybody to be at the top of their game. You want everybody to be as powerful as they can be, to bring everything that they've got to the table. And so what you see over and over again in these organizations is stuff that nobody would have expected, is, the guy in manufacturing, who used to be just a machine operator, who suddenly shows all these other talents that nobody had ever seen, and just completely blossoms, and the woman in accounting who suddenly writes marketing copies because, she's actually an amazing writer, but there was never any place for that piece. Or, and so you absolutely have natural hierarchies, totally fluid, ever-changing hierarchies of experience, of interest.
And you trust that people are going to recognize these natural hierarchies, and they're going to have help because they're going to have feedback from other people.
Yeah.
And so these natural hierarchies can be trusted.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And people are, there's just common sense. I mean, let's say that you're, a really gifted marketing person. Everybody knows, you have a marketing question, you need advice. Well, let's go ask Jeff. And so there's actually an interesting space for competition with cooperation. These two poles where people compete to be helpful. People compete to be visible, to be contributing. That's how people look up to you. It's because you do cool stuff, because you've listened well to their advice and you've made great decisions.
And again, how deeply fulfilling is that, to be seen for what you actually have to offer and to be able to give it? Oh my God. All right. So
one breakthrough, self-management.
Yeah. All right. So you use an example in your book that I think maybe you could do a quick, explain it quickly to us. And that's this Buurtzorg nursing organization. Yeah. And I think it's such a good example because, we're all being folded, spindled, and mutilated by the healthcare system. Yeah. And this really just takes that on full frontal. So,
it's maybe the most beautiful or easy story to tell because it offers such a vivid contrast between, management as we know it, sort of this management that looks at organizations as machines, management of modernity, the management of MBAs, and then what's happening now, right? So in the Netherlands, in the 1980s, the Dutch state, who pays for healthcare, because hooray, we have free healthcare in Europe, they, were just convinced that they had to use this modern management system and bring that to, these nurses that were working in people's homes, right? So we're talking about home care. So nurses that don't work in hospitals, who don't work in hospitals, but in people's homes. And so they had these, ideas that all make sense from this modern perspective. They said, these nurses that used to work on their own or in small teams, that's not very efficient. We should have economies of scale. And we'll have economies of scale by forcing them to join larger organizations. And then we can do a number of cool things. We can start specializing the nurses, because we know that the older, more experienced nurses, we have to pay them more. So let's have these nurses do the complicated stuff, and all the rest we can give to cheap nurses that just come out of school. And then they realized, hey, but nurses have their own clients, their dedicated clients, and that's not very efficient, because sometimes, a nurse, doesn't have anything to do for 2 hours between two clients. We pay them, and they don't do anything. So let's break that link, and every nurse can just be dispatched to any clients. And so let's take away their phones, and let's create a call center, and clients can no longer call a nurse directly. They call the call center, and every day we dispatch a different nurse. That makes the system just so much more flexible.
Yeah, nobody's sitting around.
And nobody's sitting around. Like that's efficient, right? That's great. And then they realized, hey, some nurses are more efficient than other nurses. They're just much faster. So let's define time norms for what they started calling products, right? It's no longer care, it's products, right? So, giving a shot is a product, and, helping an older lady take a shower is a product. And so a shot is 10 minutes and a shower is 15 minutes, and changing compression stocking is 2.5 minutes. And, all of these things were timed. And then once they had that, then they said, oh, but that's wonderful. Now we can do planning, right? Which makes a lot of sense. So they started hiring this bunch of young kids from business school that they put next to the call center in the headquarters, who would use clever programs to decide, Jeff, your next day you start at 8 o'clock as a nurse with this old lady. It's a compression stocking, so at 8:02.5, you're out of the door. And then Google Maps calculates that you need 6 minutes to be at the next client. So you expect it there at 8:08.5, and then you give a shot, and then you're out there at 8:18.5. And then, Google Maps calculates 3 minutes to the next client. And that's how your day looks like.
Kill me now, man. Whew.
Oh, but isn't that wonderfully efficient, right? I mean, I'm joking, but I say that with some sadness, because I haven't done something quite like that, but in my past as a consultant, that's sort of the perspective we were operating from. That's some of the stuff that we might have done. Yeah. Because it just makes so much sense.
Well, no, this is knitted into the culture of a lot of organizations. Yeah. In fact, that's what organizations are striving for.
Exactly. And then you can do, but let's do continuous improvement now that we do this, because we can ask the nurses to scan a barcode every time they go into a client's house. So we have a central data system that knows exactly where they are, how much time they take. And so me as a manager, I can now look at all the nurses and I look, hey, Jeff, somehow, for the showers, you always take 18 minutes rather than 15 on average. So we can train you, to go down to 15. Wow, that's great, man. And so we do continuous improvement. And of course, the result of that is a system that looks wonderfully efficient. Everything is accounted for, and we have targets and objectives, and we have these internal consultants who try to improve everything. But there's this huge shadow side, which is that you hate your job and your clients hate the service, right? So you as a nurse, you've chosen this because you want to give good care. And the system makes that you're perpetually late. And that very often that you're doing the wrong thing. You see a client and you see that something isn't quite right, but you have absolutely no time to go into, after asking questions.
You're there to change your compression stockings.
Exactly, right? Or you come in and then you say, okay, I'm here for the compression stockings. And the old woman says, yeah, that's what it says on paper. But yesterday I talked to the doctor and he actually said, and you say like, you know what, sorry, I don't have time to listen. You put the compression stocking, you're out.
Right.
And your soul bleeds because that's not what you wanted to do. But the system, just pushes you. You're already 6 minutes behind schedule. And clients hate it because every day there's a new nurse coming in. And they have to re-explain everything in the privacy home. Often there's somewhat, older, maybe confused people, and they just hate it, right?
It's terrible. They don't feel seen. No, there's no connection allowed to happen. So, we're ready for the next thing already, Fred.
Yeah, and then there's this amazing man that comes along. His name is Block, and he's been one of these nurses, for 10 years. He's experienced all of these changes. He's even gone into management and tried to change these systems from within and couldn't do it. And at some point he quit and he said, I can't do this anymore. And he had a vision of how to do this differently. And he created Beardsorg, originally, with just 4 people 10 years ago. And it's now grown to 14,000 people. It's just this extraordinary story.
And it's Beardsorg Nursing, Beurtzorg Nursing.
Exactly. So, which means in Dutch means simply neighborhood care. And his vision was very simple. He says, my purpose is not to change compression stockings or give shots as efficiently as possible. The purpose is somehow for people to be able to live the richest, most autonomous lives that they can with whatever conditions they have. And so they immediately went back to a model where every patient just sees 1 or 2 nurses, always the same, create very deep bonds. And the first thing a nurse does is sit down and drink coffee and take real time to say, hey, where are you at in your life? What can you still do? What can you no longer do? What's your network of support? And they actively help those people rebuild a network of support. Or you have your children in town, but you don't really get along. Maybe I can be there and you have a meeting and I can tell them how they might help you. They go, ring at the door of neighbors and say, do you know the old lady next door? Would it be okay for me to introduce you so that you could help her if she needs help? They really do that kind of thing. So they just create these extraordinary relationships trying to help people regain autonomy next to giving care.
We'd have 1 or 2 nurses that this patient can rely on. Those are my people.
Exactly. Sometimes for years, sometimes till terminal care. I mean, it's just amazing the depth of knowledge. I've sat in team meetings of some of these nurses, and the degree to which they know their clients, the degree to which they care. The daughter called me and she no longer believes that my mom, her mom can take her medications. She believes her mom is confused and it's dangerous, but I know her. She can take them. Like they fight for their clients. It's amazing. And And of course, clients love that, nurses love that. And so it becomes a success story where, suddenly, there's now 14,000 people working there. There's more than 2/3 of all the neighborhood nurses in the Netherlands work for this one organization, because they just receive hundreds of CVs a month, of nurses saying, can we please work for you? Because we don't want to take this other thing. Mm-hmm. By the way, what's fascinating about that story is that some people, there's been researched on by KPMG and Ernst & Young, and to look at the financial aspect and also the medical aspect of Buurtzorg, because of course it's easy to do great care and meet with children and neighbors and stuff if you have time for that, but who has time for that? We're trying to shave every minute of every procedure, right? So and what they found is that Buurtzorg actually uses less than 40% of the hours prescribed by doctors.
Wow.
Because patients become autonomous so much faster. So there's this total paradox that, they end up being radically more effective than the system that was entirely built around shaving every minute of every procedure. They're saving the Dutch state hundreds of millions of euros mm-hmm. through that mechanism. So much so that I recently heard that, the Dutch medical system no longer requires Buurtzorg to have a doctor's prescription for their services. They just trust that Buurtzorg will do the right thing, which is amazing when you think about, how all of our health systems are completely built on, control. Mm-hmm. And
that's fantastic. Yeah.
But what is really striking is, to me, of course, and is how Buurtzorg is organized from the inside, so their management, because from the inside, it looks nothing like these, other healthcare organizations. So in Buurtzorg, with now 14,000 people, you no longer have a single manager. You really have nobody holding power over anybody else. These nurses work in small teams of 10 to 12, self-managing nurses. So there's no team leader in that team. They distribute all of the management tasks.
There are rules.
There are absolutely rules. There are roles.
Because you're making me nervous.
Yes. Relax. But so seriously, so what happens is when all these nurses, send their CVs to Buurtzorg says, hey, here's a number of other CVs received in your neighborhood. Go and meet and see if you feel like you can do this together. And when you feel like you've met enough and you feel like, you can trust each other, we will simply teach you how to operate in self-management. And we'll teach you these rules, like how do you guys make decisions in when there's no boss? How do we deal with conflicts? And how do we give one another feedback? And how do you run efficient meetings? And so they teach these nurses these basics of self-management. How do we distribute the roles, right? Jeff, you're great at planning. Why don't you do the weekend planning and the holiday planning that nobody wants to do? Mm-hmm. And, I'm good with doctors. Let me take care of the relationship with the doctors. And somebody else, is a good mediator. So when we have conflict, she will take care of the conflict. And somebody else is...
Teams, of course, they know what they need. So they hire they're in charge of hiring. I'm assuming they have a mechanism for firing.
Absolutely. So all of these things are pretty well spelled out. There's now 1,000 teams. So there's, a lot of experience with this. And, next to these 1,000 people, 14,000 nurses, you have this tiny headquarters of 50 people who do mostly administrative work, right? So this organization has no CFO. There's no chief finance officer. There's no head of marketing. They've never spent $1 in marketing. I once asked Jos de Blok, 14,000 people, at the time, I think there were 10,000, and asked him, how many sort of MBA types do you have running around? And he thinks and he says, none. It's a radically simple organization. There's really simplicity at the other side of complexity.
Now, is he there still?
He's still there, but he mostly...
on him?
I don't know exactly what it is, but he spends, I think, something like half a day or a day a week. Mm-hmm. He just mostly spends the world now giving talks and trying to help Buurtzorg-like organizations start up in all sorts of... So it's remarkable to what degree operationally the organization doesn't depend on him. The organization just... It still very much depends on him. There is a huge paradox to be the guy who holds the space for this vision and this way of operating. because we all come at it from the way we've grown up with this very hierarchical perspective. And so he has to constantly reaffirm the principles.
Yeah.
You know, if something goes wrong, somebody will say, oh, we need a control mechanism. We need managers. We need somebody to sign off the things. And then Josh comes in and says, no, remember, that's not how we do things. So he has an absolutely critical role of holding the vision, holding that space, but he makes almost no operational decisions. That's, you know, the system takes care of itself. There's no executive committee there, you know, where these things happen.
Well, and you pointed out that they're divided into teams of like 10 to 15 people. And that seems to be a magic number in general for self-managed teams throughout different kinds of industries and technologies.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And what's up with that, do you think?
I think it's very simply the maximum number where I feel that I can be heard, and where people will call me out, and where I can't hide, and where if something goes wrong, you know, and nobody else picks it up, at some point I will say, God damn it, I will pick it up. I will do it. Right? Yeah. If it's a larger number, then there's a sense of somebody will do it. So, you know, who cares? You know, I no longer want to sit in these meetings.
Yeah.
You know, they take.
I can hide out.
I can hide out.
Nobody cares anyway.
Exactly.
You know, they'll fix it. Yeah. Not my job. You know, it's suffocating. People are tired of it. Yeah. Yeah. So now we're in the self-managed teams, and it's remarkable because I can't help but think about it integrally and developmentally and all that stuff. That, you know, you mapped out organizations from red to amber to orange to green. Yeah. And, you know, of course, the vast majority of human history precedes that, where we were in bands and tribes.
Absolutely.
And bands were generally 10 to 15, maybe, you know, 30, 40, and that's it.
That's it. And
then they would be affiliated with other bands in tribes where they'd have the same culture, religion, language, that sort of thing. And that's 90+% of human history. In a way, we're, you know, at Integral, we want to be reintegrating the best of all these previous stages. And maybe this is what this is.
Yeah. And I think that's why it works so remarkably. I think in some way, this is an ancient programming in ourselves that we're rediscovering.
Is there anything more delicious than being in a group of people of about that size? We've all had that experience, and we're doing something that, you know, we have to do it together, and we're striving, and we're, it's nothing quite like it.
And I want to bring in that it's not easy.
No,
right? So,
no, it's a pain in the ass. I mean, you got to deal with these people.
Exactly, right? There's no way to hide. There's no, you know, boss that, you know, so systematically what you hear is, you know, these nurses and people in manufacturing, you know, there's a period that is really painful. You know, I can no longer blame anyone. I have to take responsibility for my life. You hear this all over. You know, the hardest thing is I can no longer blame anyone, because people will say something they don't like. You know, you have the advice process. You're powerful. Go and do and change it. Mm-hmm. And so there's a huge learning curve that goes with it. And I find this really interesting. Maybe you'll like this, Jeff. Like in a lot of these very culture-driven green organization that we talked about earlier, it's so interesting. They really put values at the center of everything they do, right? They're very values-driven. And almost unfailably, one of the values is fun or happiness, right? They really, you know, we want to be, you know, happy, you know, fun. Right. Which is wonderful, right? What a progress. But in this new stage, I didn't see a single organization that puts fun or happiness in there, which I thought was intriguing. And that is because I think what's happening here is what people really cherish above all else is growth and purpose. Yeah. Growth internally and purpose. Yep. And boy, sometimes that is not fun. Nope. Sometimes that is hard. Nope. And the last thing we do is a culture where we're supposed to be happy and have fun, which can just
because we have mask. A ping pong table.
Exactly, right? That is just another mask that we might have to wear. Like we have to look like we're happy and we're right. So sometimes these things are hard, but in the end, they're amazingly liberating. You know, there's just an amazing growth that comes with it. And some people don't like it, and some people leave. You know, there's a percentage of nurses in these teams that end up changing teams because it never works in that team, or end up going back to traditional employer. And the way I hear people describe people who don't, manage to make it is often people who've been so beaten up by the system that they find it hard to take responsibility, to grow into responsibility. And but for most people, it works remarkably well. Those people who tend to have the hardest times is former managers and people who had power over other people.
Right.
And have to learn a different system of having influence and power with people rather than power over. Yeah,
it's challenging. I can see that, I know that you sort of answer one of the objections that people have to this, that it's theoretical and it's a lot of this is ideas and but you answer back that it's actually happening. Mm-hmm. And you lay out quite a slew of companies, mostly small, right? Although I think in Patagonia, that's probably small by industrial standards. But anything you want to point out that you're seeing that's encouraging, or roadblocks, or what's the frothy edge look like?
Yeah. So what's really fascinating is that the last 3-4 years, there's been an explosion of things. Simply, the times seem to be ready for this, and so you just have hundreds and hundreds of organizations that are adopting, self-managing principles, and most of them, just because that's a majority of organizations, are quite small, especially those who make quick progress. It's easier in a small or medium-sized organizations, but there's some exciting things in larger ones. One organization who's sort of public about this is Michelin, the global tire maker. There are 110,000 people, and they experimented self-management in their production teams. Originally like 38 teams that had, volunteer supervisors who were willing to share some of their power, and that worked really well. And then they, extrapolated that to 5 entire factories, and that worked well. And now they're bringing it to 70,000 workers, which is just unprecedented in scale. And so that's just an amazing experiment to watch, and they bring it also to their 40,000 sort of more white collar jobs. And they still formally have sort of a manager for these production teams, but it's one manager for 100 people. It's only there one of the 3 shifts. So really, even if that manager wanted to manage, he or she can no longer do it. So you really have like effectively self-managing teams at the scale of 70,000. So we're starting to see some larger organizations who are embracing this, which is really exciting.
Wouldn't it be great if we cracked the code on, what the next structures of human relations are? It's actually what we're talking about here. In terms of seeing each other and organizing in optimal groups, and I don't know.
I mean, I think we're starting. In some ways, I think we have pretty much cracked the code. I mean, maybe when we get to these organizations of 70,000 or 100,000, we will still learn some additional pieces with it. But, we pretty much know how to make decisions now and what the advice process looks like. And we know what conflict resolution processes look like. And we know how to deal with what were traditionally staff functions. And we know what to do with budgets. And we know what to do with targets. I mean, there's just enough of these organizations, and every organization will tailor it. So the last thing I want to say is that there could be a manual. Like some people dream of sort of the 7 steps to do this. And you can never do this. Like this has to be emergent depending on who you are and why you want to do this and what industry you're in. But we kind of know how these things work.
Yeah. Go on.
I just want to make sure that we talk about the 2 other breakthroughs, because so often we talk so much about self-management because it seems so crazy, right? But I think there's 2 other breakthroughs that are just as important, but just more subtle. And so they sometimes get less consideration. One of them, and you alluded to it, is just, how juicy is it if we can show up in a different way? And I've labeled that, sort of striving for wholeness. So what you have in most existing traditional organizations is the sense that, I'm hiring my labor for a set number of hours a month, and people get my labor, but they don't really get me, right? There's something where it just doesn't feel safe in most organizations to be really yourself, to show up really with all of your quirks and your frustrations and your emotions and your hopes and your longings.
No, we can't deal with that. It's too much.
Yeah. And it feels like, if I really show up in that way, I will be vulnerable. Like, people know stuff about me, and that might be used against me, and it will look unprofessional. And, especially what touches me is sort of our deepest longings. Like, so many of the organizations we work in do stuff that is in some ways really shocking. Right?
Such as?
Well, the number of organizations who, just have a purpose where they sell stuff that people don't really need, where they, have to put in lots of advertising money to convince people that they're not okay, convince women that their bodies are not okay, convince men that they're not real men, that they create these artificial needs to sell products, that are manufactured in China that, use precious resources that get used once or twice and then get thrown away. Right. And so much of that is shocking and demeaning. So much of what we ask teachers with standardized testing is demeaning to teachers. What is asked to these nurses, who have 2.5 minutes to change a compression stocking and be in and out of the door. I mean, it's demeaning. I mean, but imagine being a nurse who speaks out and says, goes to their bosses, not even with a tone of anger, but just coming from this deep place of saying, you know what? I think, this is a dead end track. I'm longing for a different kind of care. And, these people, they won't survive long in the organization. There's just no space for this conversation. So we learn that it's actually safer to not show up. And I think there's even something worse is not only do we not speak these things, I think come to the stage where we don't even think these things. It's become so painful to ourselves that we put a lid on these things, even to ourselves.
It's impossible. You can't do that. So, you don't.
Yeah, but I don't even think about these things myself. I don't even want to think about them because it's so painful. And so we just hire a number of hours, of work. We give that to the organization.
Yeah, we go in and we do our thing, and the world turns. It's actually got us here, but it feels soul crushing all of a sudden.
Yeah, and I think if so many organizations feel soul crushing or feel lifeless, it is because we bring so little of our lives into the organization. There's so much of ourselves that we check out at home before we go in. But the horrible thing is, I think that sort of these masks that we wear in organizations, these professional masks where we all look confident and we pretend that we know what we're doing. And if there's a mistake, we blame other people. And, we show up, very masculine. And, all these masks that we wear, I think, so many people, so many of us never actually take off the mask even when we go home.
No, right. No, in the, sacred world to come, we're going to be more us than ever.
And so what some of these organizations have realized is that, if you hide so much behind a mask, there's also that much of your energy, of your passion, of your creativity that doesn't get expressed in work.
Right.
And so they very consciously try to create spaces that feel safe enough for us to show up whole in the full glory and messiness of our humanity.
And what would that look like?
Well,
I mean, in terms of what kind of spaces or how
it's extraordinarily vibrant. Let me say that. Like I've seen organizations that are just vibrant in a way that it's hard to put into words, right? And I was just struck at some point in my research. There was this almost the same sentence I heard for the third time, and it was somebody who said, sometimes I wish my life at home could be more like my life at work.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And it means here it feels real, it feels juicy, it feels alive. And I haven't been able to manage to do that at home.
Well, again, if we think about the what it would feel like to be in a tribe or a band of people where we're out and we're on our adventure and we're together and we're relying on each other, and look at you and look at me. And there's nothing like it. Yeah, it's just so fulfilling.
Exactly. And again, it's also messy. right? I mean, but so when you have conflict, rather than shy away from conflict, in the best of cases, we have mechanisms that help us deal with that shit. And once we've gone through that, well, you know, I want to hug you. We've just had this really profound moment that was really tense. But so, you know, I've learned where you're coming from, and I see you now, you know, and I know more about you than I knew before, and you know more about me, and right. And so, you know, in the best of cases, that, you know, that's the kind of things that happen, you know, and you have yearly performance evaluation conversations where people literally, you know, have tears in their eyes because they feel seen so deeply. Right? Yeah. And again, we kind of know how to do this. It's not magic. And this, we've known how to do this, say, in some spiritual setting or retreat settings, right? So we've known how to do this. And we're increasingly learning how to do this in organizations. And so it simply requires that we start to do pretty much all of the HR processes. You know, how do we recruit people? How do we evaluate one another? How do we deal with conflict? How do we do all of these things differently? That we create spaces where we can talk from a deeper place. You know, and at some point it struck me, for instance, you know, if you take something like recruitment, right? In most organizations, that's where the lying starts, right? Because the organization, there's not even this whole field called employer branding, right? Where the employer tries to use marketing techniques to try to look like this desirable employer, you know, and hide all of the reality of what it is in the organization.
Well, the employees doing the same thing.
And the employees, you know, I write my CV and I hide some things, and I hope that you won't find out about these things.
There's a whole art to it.
Right? And then we have this first meeting, you know, this first interview, and it's this whole ridiculous dance where you're trying to see through my lies and I'm trying to see through your lies, right? That's what the interview basically is, right? I mean, the lying basically starts from the very beginning, right? The masks start from the very beginning. And how can we do recruiting in a different way? How can we do recruiting where...
Well, how can we? What's the way that they do it with these self-managed teams?
Well, if you take Beardsark, you know, there is no HR, right? So in traditional organizations, you know, there's dedicated HR person that receives all these CVs, tries to sift through, compare them, you know, is probably not a nurse, but a trained HR psychologist trying, you know, to ask all these, and it's trained in all of these interview mechanisms, right? And so, you know, what we know, the best practice in interviewing is, you know, ask people about their 3 strengths and ask them stories, and, you know, all these, you know, they're trained to these things. And so then people get trained to respond to these questions, right? Here, it's just one of these nurses that has raised their hands and said, you know what, for the next 6 months, okay, I'm happy to do the recruitment, right? And they just meet and they just talk. And that nurse has no interest of selling their team, because next week they will work here and that nurse will look at me and say, you've completely lied to me. You've oversold these things. So I'm telling them the truth. I just want to see, do we want to work together? So what recruiting becomes is a sort of much more honest exploration of, are we meant to be together?
Yeah.
You know, and
well, yeah, it's sort of an up-leveling in all kinds of ways.
Yeah.
You know, where you just have a different set of antenna.
Exactly.
When you go out there and look for new members of this precious team that you're on, my goodness, it really matters. And
it's pretty much no bullshit. I mean, imagine these factory workers just hiring another factory worker, right? I mean, there's no bullshit there, right? I mean, they just talk. Now, in the best of cases, these can be really profound and meaningful conversations where they talk about the organization's purpose. And you, Jeff, you know, does that resonate with you? And what is your purpose? And, you know, does it mean something? And where does your purpose come from? And tell us a little bit about, you know, why that is important to you. And then you start telling some stories about how you've grown up and some of the experience. And we just get to know one another on such a deeper level. And, you know, it's that simple. So you know, it took me a while to see this, but what is striking about all of these practices, whether it's self-management or practice related to wholeness, is that in many ways, they're just dramatically simpler than all of these complex practices that we used to have.
It's the simplicity beyond complexity. I think you said that earlier.
We're really stripping away at the complexity.
All right, so we have self-management, we have wholeness. And the other emergent is?
You know, I reuse the term of evolutionary purpose. And so it's misleading because a lot of people simply assume that, oh, it means that the organization sort of has a noble purpose. But that's not it. It's actually much more profound. And it chips away at this whole paradigm that we've inherited from modernity, that the role of leadership is to predict and control the future, right? That was the whole project of science and modernity. Is, let's predict and control nature, let's predict and control. And so we've built this whole arsenal of tools. We have, a 10-year strategic outlook and then 3-year strategic plan and then yearly budgets. And then we, cascade it down in the organizations with KPIs and then every month we compare our, actuals to budgets. And then, based on that, we give incentives and bonus and stock options and all of that, right? So this whole notion of the role of leadership is to predict and control the future. Right, have a brilliant strategy and then execute it. Make sure that everybody just executes according to plan. And, it's striking how pretty much all of the founders of these other organizations or leaders, these trusted blocks, no longer believe in that. They say, the world is just too complex. And who am I, even with the cleverest of consultants, to try and predict and control the future, right? Whatever plan I make, in 6 months, things are going to be shifting. And probably if we're just focused on that plan, we will actually not see that reality is shifting, right? That's why, all these big organizations go through these endless painful cycles of trying to operate to plan. And then 3 years later, suddenly like, oh shit, we have to do this massive reorganization because we missed this trend, we missed this thing. And suddenly, this big painful.
An oft-told story.
And so there's a shift from predict and control to sense and respond, right? I didn't mention this, but I talked about the previous metaphors, right? An organization like a wolf pack, an organization like an army, an organization like a machine, right? An organization like a family, that's the metaphor for this culture-driven green organization, right? And the metaphor, it's so striking of all of the people in this space, they all use metaphors from nature. They all say, we as an organization are sort of a living organism, or an ecosystem. It's striking how they use this metaphor. And so living organism constantly sense and respond to their environment.
Right on.
And so what happens is that you get rid of pretty much all of these, 3-year strategic plans and yearly budgets and all of that arsenal. And instead try to constantly sense and respond to what is needed now. What do we know today that we didn't know yesterday? One of the organizations is a fabulous organization, Favi, it's a manufacturing organization. And they use this thing where they say, traditional organizations, look 5 years ahead and plan for the next year. And they say, what? We're like farmers. We look 20 years ahead and plan for the next day.
That's nice.
So that's sort of the sense and respond.
Yeah, that's good. That helps me sort of, I'm trying to feel my way into this. It's a new stage of human history. Yeah. It's a new stage of human development. So we think differently, we relate differently, we respond differently. And just actually feeling into that idea of the organization as an organism is, it does change the way I respond and think and act.
Let me tell you my favorite story that illustrates sort of this shift, and it's again a story from Buurtzorg. So one of the teams in Buurtzorg at some point has this insight and says, what we're doing is care, but boy, we should be doing prevention too. Like a lot of our patients are these older patients, and sometimes they fall and they break their hip or they break their knee. Now we can replace hips and knees, but still, people lose some of their autonomy, and so they just went out there and they found some, physical therapists and some people who know about this stuff, and just developed this program where they taught some of their older patients, how to be careful not to fall, what changes they could do in their house, how to get out of a chair, and, just a number of basic things that reduces the risk of falling. And then they had some public lectures in the neighborhood where everybody was invited, and they just thought this was great. It was very successful. And they went to talk about this with Jos de Blok, the founder, and said, hey, we think all the team should do this. And what was so interesting to me was Jos de Blok's response. So here is what he would have done, if he was working in the old paradigm of predicting control, right? He would have probably put an internal team or a team of consultants, to really look at this question and analyze it and say, is there a market for it? Can we do prevention? And, what's the business model? And, how is that going to work?
What's the demand?
What's the demand and all of that? And, and so this team works hard, for 3 months and then makes a presentation to the steering committee or the executive committee that at some point, has them to make a go, no go decision, right? And imagine that it's a go decision, right? The executive committee says, okay, go. Then they decide, okay, now we have to roll this out to the entire organization, right? We have to implement this, and so how do we do this? Well, maybe we have a pilot region and we implement it for 3 months. And then, we have a rollout plan for the next 2 years. And, every 2 months there's a new region that comes online and we have some internal trainers and we have a budget. And, that's just how we do things. That's how
everybody does things.
Exactly. That's how I did it as a consultant. It just makes sense. How else would you do it, right? And that made sense to me up until the moment I started doing this research and encountering these other organizations. And so let me tell you now how Jos de Blok did react, because he didn't do this. And his reaction was, in a sense, I like this. This makes a lot of sense for me. But who am I to make that call, whether this is where the organization needs to go? And so he invited this team to package their approach and write an article and share it on their internal social network that they have, which is the way that this whole organization coordinates. And so they wrote up their story in a sexy way. And then they just had sort of the package, like, this is how we contracted with the physical therapists, and this is how we do tours in the houses, and this is the presentation we gave, and this is, and, within a number of months, half of the other teams, the teams had adopted this. They just said, like, cool, we like this. Of course, by any means, let's do it. And what I like about that story is suddenly, this was actually in some ways a profound inflection. Buurtzorg went from being care to care and prevention. But it was never formally decided in any way. The system just sensed and responded, and the system just morphed into a new version of itself.
Yeah.
And so what happens in Buurtzorg is you have these 1,000 teams, and teams are constantly experimenting with things and innovating. And the good innovations spread throughout that ecosystem. And other innovations aren't so good, and other people don't adopt them. But there's no bottleneck of this going through a steering committee, an executive committee. Like, these things just happen organically and spread organically. And the good things just spread very quickly. The not so good things fold, and that's okay.
And it's a natural expression of what you would do if you really cared about your patients, and you really wanted to be as helpful as possible in this world.
Yeah.
I mean, you would do that.
Yeah. But think about how the innovation, gets multiplied. Like, you now have these, that's what I was saying earlier, you now have these 14,000 nurses, who can all sense into something could be better. I have an idea. Something here isn't working. Mm-hmm. And I just have the power to experiment it. And, if this proves successful, suddenly everybody else is going to want to do it. Mm-hmm. And I don't have to convince my manager and then convince another manager and another manager.
And you call this evolutionary
purpose.
Yeah. So this is the procreant urge, or this is the thing that's it's built into the system that we want to grow.
We want to sense into that evolutionary purpose. So if you want to express it in a semi-spiritual way, it's this notion that we no longer need to tell the organization what to do with a strategy or plan, because there's the sense that the organization is a living entity, a living organism that has its own sense of direction, its own energy, its own thing to manifest in the world. And so our stance in many ways is much more humble, and it's simply to say, to listen, to,
where does this organization want to go? Like, where is this organization meeting a need in the world, a purpose in the world? And let's just dance with it. Let's just help it, materialize that, because the organization needs us physical human beings to express its purpose.
Oh, yeah. Well, amen, brother.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. May it be so.
Yeah.
All right, Fred. Well, before we close, if people are interested in knowing more about reinventing organizations and how they might work with your ideas, where would they go?
So there's, just a lot of stuff, obviously if they're readers, they can read the thick detailed book that talks about like a lot of these practices. They can read the illustrated version that you prefer. There's also talks I've given, that are online if you prefer watching videos. There's a wiki that sort of details a lot of these practices. Okay, so what's the advice process? Sort of a mini Wikipedia. Okay, so conflict resolution, budgets, like, if you want to look at these more granular things. I'm right now in the process of recording a video series that will have over 100 videos about, okay, so you are a traditional large organization and you want to move in this direction. What do we know about that journey?
Oh, fantastic.
There's more and more organizations who do this, and we start to learn, this is all very much emerging. So I don't claim that we've got it all nailed by any means, but we start to learn sort of the pitfalls in that journey, and some cool things. And so I'm creating this video series, which is called Insights for the Journey. So if you want to watch that. And the other thing I want to stress, I've talked about here stuff that's related to my work. There's also communities, there's meetups happening in all sorts of places around the world. There's an online news hub called Enlivening Edge that publishes tons of articles. But
Enlivening Edge?
Yeah, enliveningedge.org, which I don't run. It's just a number of people who are interested in this field and do great work. And I'm just one voice among many. So what's really exciting is that there just seems to be this transitioning that is happening. And, some people resonate a lot with the way I've expressed it, and other people feel like it's, sort of the wholeness part and, feels a little too, touchy-feely or spiritual, and they like, so you mentioned there's, a whole movement around holacracy, and there's a movement around another thing called sociocracy. And, there's lots of other voices. There's a guy called Gary Hamel, who's, a big name in this space. So there's just so many other players in that space, and I would just urge you to find your niche and the person, that you resonate with most closely.
Yeah.
But stuff is happening, and organizations are shifting.
Well, these are ideas whose time has come. We need it. We're bored, Fred.
Yes, we're bored.
Thanks for showing us the next stage organization. Appreciate it.
That was fun.
All right. Well, really fun talking with you. And
Same here.
Thanks for joining me. And thank you, everybody, for joining me. And again, it's Frederic Laloux and his book and movement, Reinventing Organizations. Thanks again, Fred.
Thanks.